Hello, this is Hermetic Hipster and welcome to my channel. The world of darkness has its roots in the 1990s and sometimes it shows. What originally felt cutting edge and fresh can often feel tired and stereotypical in some of the new games. That is just how media works though, and for a game series like the World of Darkness that uses its core drive as their relevancy to our real life and real issues, this kind of thing is inevitable. And the older books often date much more obviously than more fanciful games like D&D or hard sci-fi. Often, older books can be accused by the fanbase of being edgy for edgy's sake, but I do mostly think that at the time of publishing, what is seen now as cringy and edgelord was actually very appropriate. I mention this edgy hangover for the tradition we're going to look at today, as they are without a doubt the most edgy, cool in the 90s and goth, despite what the Hollow One fans will tell you, of all of the factions of Mage, the leather-wearing, skull-owning disciples of fate and eyeliner, the Euthanatoi. Before we look at this tradition, however, many of you will know that I've written a book for Mage that is up for sale on the Storyteller's Vault, the Hermetic Hipster's Guide to the Traditions. Since its release, it's stayed in the top 10 hottest on the Vault, and I'm extremely proud of it, and even more thankful to everyone who's bought it and supported it. It's a player-focused sourcebook for the traditions, with new backgrounds, merits and flaws, as well as all new artwork and fictions about real supporters of the channel and the book's characters. And even the topic of this video, the Euthanatoi tradition, have their own section. If you want to pick up a copy, you're not only supporting my channel, but you're also getting a lovely read for yourself. Of course, if you can't get a copy, then watching and subscribing also means the world to me, and thank you to everybody who has. With that out of the way, let's look at the most brooding and edgy of traditions and find out why they're far deeper than they at first might appear, the Euthanatos. A good place to start understanding Euthanatos is their name. To euthanize is to kill with mercy, often to relieve suffering. Many Euthanatos, that's a pretty simple version of their mission. Fate's assassins, guardians of the wheel, they strive to keep reality running smoothly by weeding out those lives that are having an overly negative impact on others. The Euthanatos have a deep and ancient history, being perhaps the second oldest tradition after the Akashic Brotherhood, who their early history is intertwined with. But unlike many traditions who can trace their history back to some ancient group or other, the modern Euthanatoi are more of a collection of scattered death cultists than a group with an actual unified history at all. The Greek Euthanatoi and Indian Chakravanti are joined by Celtic death druids, Roman priests, African funeral ritualists, and many more, all unified in the belief in fate and the inevitability of life and death. To start with their history though, there is a single point we can focus on: the Himalayan Wars. Covered from the Akashic point of view in my video on them, the Himalayan Wars were a conflict every bit as bloody and high stakes as the modern Ascension War, and one fought much more in the open. Before this, Indian spiritualists had been an evolving and adapting group with their own important landmark events, but it really was the Himalayan Wars that formed the Chakravanti, and therefore the orthodoxy of the Euthanatoi as a whole. The start of the war was a simple misunderstanding. The home regions of the Akashics in the Himalayas and the home region of the Phantomic cults in the Ganges Basin meant that both groups were aware of one another and had even interacted and shared ideas. There were always differences, with the death priests seeing the Akashics as too removed and aloof from the world, and the Brotherhood seeing the death cultists as being too willing to get their hands dirty in service of fate. This meant that peaceful coexistence simply wasn't to last. One day in the area of Bhutan, an Akashic warrior by the name of White Tiger was out walking and came across a healer by the name of Ranjit, who was killing plague victims who he deemed too weak to survive treatment, and to save them from painful, drawn-out death, but also to stop the spread of plague they had contracted. White Tiger was outraged at what he saw as a bloodthirsty act and either killed Ranjit with prejudice or by accident. Accounts differ in the motivations behind why this happened, with Euthanatoi saying Ranjit was genuinely surprised at White Tiger's objections and acting in good faith, but Akashic sources saying that the Death Priest was deliberately provoking the Akashics to spark a war, as they had determined that a conflict was needed to push the loose Death Priest practices in the region into a more unified organisation. Be it misunderstanding or provocation, the result was war, and the Akashics were the aggressors. At first, the Akashics struck with extreme violence against proto-Euthanatoi lands, to the great surprise of many. Towns and temples were destroyed, and lands were devastated, as this is what happens when two awakened groups openly engage in combat with one another. Akashics had a more unified organisation though, so the early years of the war saw them get the upper hand, despite the Death Cultists' undeniable power. The war became bloody and intergenerational, with the severity of the conflict meaning mages were being born into Jaw and vendettas against other newborns they would only encounter years in the future. The Death Cultists realised that their time had come to unify, and so they could fight more effectively against the Brotherhood, and after doing so in a grand ritual, they created a giant incarnation of Hindu gods that destroyed the southern Akashic strongholds and solidified the newly codified Chakravanti as a powerful force to be reckoned with. The enmity between the Akashics and the Euthanatoi still exists to this day, and the legacy of so many avatars stained by war still haunts both traditions. Some of the Chakravanti eventually go west, retracing the footsteps of the armies of Alexander the Great, and many Western death mages can trace their lineage, or at least the inspiration, back to this influence. This also explains why there's such a strong tradition of death mages in the region of Greece throughout history. After a while, another conflict erupted with the Al-Ilbatan when they came to India following the armies of Islam and the Mughals. The Chakravanti and groups that would become the Cult of Ecstasy formed an alliance that still exists into the modern nights to resist them. This alliance made the Chakravanti join the traditions when they were formed relatively easy, as the powerful ecstatic mage Salazar was a major driving force behind the formations of the tradition, and he approached the Chakravanti personally. This great unifying saw the Chakravanti come together with many other death mages from around the world, including from across the Atlantic, and another great sharing of knowledge and tradition made the Euthanatoi very powerful. Despite this, many of their newly found allies in the tradition saw them as little better than Nafandi, and it wasn't until the heroic actions of the Euthanatos mage Cygnus Morrow, who refused to sell out his allies even under torture by the Order of Reason, that the group began to see the appreciation that they deserved. Like many traditions, the Euthanatoi, and especially the Chakravanti, suffered under the expanding technocratic paradigm, especially in colonial areas where millennia-old ways of life were undermined and destroyed within the space of decades. India was especially bad for this, and British oppression was mirrored in the Order of Reason's kill squads and persecutions. At the time, colonial and Macon Mage would not really see any difference between Nafandi, marauders and traditionalists, seeing them all as evil mystics to be wiped out. In modern times, the Euthanatoi are about as varied as a tradition can get, with strong themes of fatalism and acceptance of death being reflected in the many mystic practices across many cultures. Throughout history, the Euthanatoi showed their wisdom and often ended up on the right side of history, despite being derided at the time, being strongly opposed to such evils as colonialism in America and India, Nazis in Europe, and the slave trade in Africa. Closeness to death and fate often gave them insights into these evils. However, there are consequences for this, and the Euthanatoi are famously very vulnerable to quiet or magical madness, especially Jaw, the madness of morbid death obsession, meaning that many Euthanatois do step over that line and become what their critics say they are, psychopathic and remorseless killers. To play Euthanatoi is to embrace at least a little bit of darkness into your characters, but at the same time, it doesn't mean you have to be permanently bleak. A great example of the attitude of Euthanatoi are the personifications of death in both Sandman by Neil Gaiman and the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, who are both relatively upbeat and positive, seeing death not as a bad thing to be feared, but simply just one more step on the path of reality. When playing one, I would highly recommend looking at the fractions of the tradition, as Celtic death mages, African philosophers, and Mesoamerican warrior priests are all extremely cool inspirations for characters. Another famous trope of the tradition is the Assassin of Fate, a mage who does the dirty deeds so others don't have to, straight out of a film noir movie. This can be extremely cool to play in a group setting, and often playing up the personal conflict over this duty to fate is great personal plot. The Euthanatoi use entropy with great effect, holding the seat of entropy on the Council of Nine. Entropy is sometimes a bit of a tricky sphere to use, especially the fate and chance side of things. Early in my mage experience, I had players telling me that you could do anything with entropy, as anything was technically possible, and bragging about stopping people's hearts or spontaneously combusting people kind of put me off this sphere. In reality though, that's not how it should work. Or rather, the magic needed to cause such truly unlikely events is so great that it becomes utterly impractical for use in fieldwork. If you want guidance on how to use fate and fortune magic effectively, I've linked my video on the topic in the description below. Another aspect to play up with Euthanatoi is that of jaw, and the fact that if you kill enough people for supposedly the right reasons, you become the monsters that you sought to stop. Remember that to loved ones or allies of a person you killed for the greater good, your mystic ramblings about the wheel and karma often will not be any comfort, and you simply will be, in their reality, the bad guy. In my book, The Hermetic Hipster's Guide to the Traditions, the Euthanatoi get access to a special background called Dharmic Duty, a background that rewards you for killing off those damned souls that need to return to the wheel with good fortune. It also gives you risk of accruing jaw, however, so balancing your devotion to this duty becomes a personal choice of how far down the rabbit hole you're willing to push yourself. There are also several special merits, such as Reincarnated, that lets you connect with your past lives background even easier, and flaws, like Compassionate Soul, that makes your killing in the name of fate all the more guilt-ridden. Euthanatoi are, by their nature, one of the darker traditions, and are great for exploring ideas about death cycles and for playing a more of an anti-hero character for whom the ends justify the means. Euthanatoi are a strong option for personal plot as well, as it lets you experience the risk of jaw and look into your own personal abyss. Thank you very much for listening to my video on the dark and brooding Euthanatoi. And if you would like to help decide the next tradition for a video, comment your favourite below. Please like and subscribe and all that good jazz, and if you really want to help out the channel and get a present for yourself, you can find the link to my book in Storyteller's Vault below. This has been The Hermetic Hipster, and thank you very much for watching.